Solus cum solo, in loco remoto, non cogitabuntur orare pater noster. Marius, dreamer as he was, as we have said, firm and energetic by nature. His habits of solitary meditation, while they had developed in him sympathy and compassion, had, perhaps, diminished the faculty for irritation, but had left intact the power of waxing indignant. He had the kindliness of a Brahmin, and the severity of a judge. He took pity upon a toad, but he crushed a viper. Now, it was into a hole of vipers that his glance had just been directed, it was a nest of monsters that he had beneath his eyes. "These wretches must be stamped upon," said he. Not one of the enigmas which he had hoped to see solved had been elucidated. On the contrary, all of them had been rendered more dense, if anything. He knew nothing more about the beautiful maiden of the Luxembourg and the man whom he called M. Leblanc, except that Jondrette was acquainted with them. Athwart the mysterious words which had been uttered, the only thing of which he caught a distinct glimpse was the fact that an ambush was in course of preparation, a dark but terrible trap. That both of them were incurring great danger, she probably, her father certainly. That they must be saved. That the hideous plots of the Jondrettes must be thwarted, and the web of these spiders broken. He scanned the female Jondrette for a moment. She had pulled an old sheet iron stove from a corner, and she was rummaging among the old heap of iron. He descended from the commode as softly as possible, taking care not to make the least noise. Amid his terror as to what was in preparation, and in the horror with which the Jondrettes had inspired him, he experienced a sort of joy at the idea that it might be granted to him perhaps to render a service to the one whom he loved. But how was it to be done? How warn the persons threatened? He did not know their address. They had reappeared for an instant before his eyes, and had then plunged back again into the immense depths of Paris. Should he wait for M. Leblanc at the door that evening at 6 o'clock, at the moment of his arrival, and warn him of the trap? But Jondrette and his men would see him on the watch. The spot was lonely, they were stronger than he, they would devise means to seize him or to get him away, and the man whom Marius was anxious to save would be lost. 1 o'clock had just struck, the trap was to be sprung at 6. Marius had 5 hours before him. There was but one thing to be done. He put on his decent coat, knotted a silk handkerchief round his neck, took his hat, and went out, without making any more noise than if he had been treading on moss with bare feet. Moreover, the Jondrette woman continued to rummage among her old iron. Once outside of the house, he made for the Rue du Petit Banquier. He had almost reached the middle of this street. Near a very low wall which a man can easily step over at certain points, and which abuts on a waste space, and was walking slowly, in consequence of his preoccupied condition, and the snow deadened the sound of his steps. All at once he heard voices talking very close by. He turned his head, the street was deserted, there was not a soul in it, it was broad daylight, and yet he distinctly heard voices. It occurred to him to glance over the wall which he was skirting. There, in fact, sat 2 men, flat on the snow, with their backs against the wall, talking together in subdued tones. These 2 persons were strangers to him. One was a bearded man in a blouse, and the other a long-haired individual in rags. The bearded man had on a fez, the other's head was bare, and the snow had lodged in his hair. By thrusting his head over the wall, Marius could hear their remarks. The hairy one jogged the other man's elbow and said, "With the assistance of Patron Minette, it can't fail." "Do you think so?" said the bearded man. And the long-haired one began again. "It's as good as a warrant for each one, of 500 balls, and the worst that can happen is 5 years, 6 years, 10 years at the most." The other replied with some hesitation, and shivering beneath his fez, "That's a real thing. You can't go against such things." "I tell you that the affair can't go wrong," resumed the long-haired man. "Father Watts his name's team will be already harnessed." Then they began to discuss a melodrama that they had seen on the preceding evening at the Gate Theatre. Marius went his way. It seemed to him that the mysterious words of these men, so strangely hidden behind that wall, and crouching in the snow, could not but bear some relation to Jondret's abominable projects. That must be the affair. He directed his course towards the Faubourg Saint-Marceau and asked at the first shop he came to where he could find a commissary of police. He was directed to Rue de Pontoise, No. 14. Thither Marius betook himself. As he passed a baker's shop, he bought a 2-penny roll, and ate it, foreseeing that he should not dine. On the way, he rendered justice to Providence. He reflected that had he not given his 5 francs to the Jondret girl in the morning, he would have followed M. Leblanc's fiacre, and consequently have remained ignorant of everything, and that there would have been no obstacle to the trap of the Jondrets, and that M. Leblanc would have been lost, and his daughter with him, no doubt. Chapter 14. In which a police agent bestows 2 fistfuls on a lawyer. On arriving at No. 14, Rue de Pontoise, he ascended to the first floor and inquired for the commissary of police. "The commissary of police is not here," said a clerk. "But there is an inspector who takes his place. Would you like to speak to him? Are you in haste?" "Yes," said Marius. The clerk introduced him into the commissary's office. There stood a tall man behind a grating, leaning against a stove, and holding up with both hands the tails of a vast topcoat, with 3 collars. His face was square, with a thin, firm mouth, thick, grey, and very ferocious whiskers, and a look that was enough to turn your pockets inside out. Of that glance it might have been well said, not that it penetrated, but that it searched. This man's air was not much less ferocious nor less terrible than Jondret's. The dog is, at times, no less terrible to meet than the wolf. "What do you want?" he said to Marius, without adding Monsieur. "Is this Monsieur le Commissaire de Police?" "He is absent. I am here in his stead." "The matter is very private." "Then speak." "And great haste is required." "Then speak quick." This calm, abrupt man was both terrifying and reassuring at one and the same time. He inspired fear and confidence. Marius related the adventure to him. That a person with whom he was not acquainted otherwise than by sight, was to be inveigled into a trap that very evening. That, as he occupied the room adjoining the den, he, Marius Pontmercy, a lawyer, had heard the whole plot through the partition. That the wretch who had planned the trap was a certain Jondret. That there would be accomplices, probably some prowlers of the barriers, among others a certain Punchard, alias Printanier, alias Bigrenail. That Jondret's daughters were to lie in wait. That there was no way of warning the threatened man, since he did not even know his name. And that, finally, all this was to be carried out at 6 o'clock that evening, at the most deserted point of the Boulevard de l'Hôpital, in house No. 50-52. At the sound of this number, the inspector raised his head, and said coldly, "So it is in the room at the end of the corridor?" "Precisely," answered Marius, and he added, "Are you acquainted with that house?" The inspector remained silent for a moment, then replied, as he warmed the heel of his boot at the door of the stove. "Apparently." He went on, muttering between his teeth, and not addressing Marius so much as his cravat. "Patron Minette must have had a hand in this." This word struck Marius. "Patron Minette," said he, "I did hear that word pronounced, in fact." And he repeated to the inspector the dialogue between the long-haired man and the bearded man in the snow behind the wall of the Rue du Petit Boncoeur. The inspector muttered. The long-haired man must be Brujon, and the bearded one Demiliard, alias du Milliards. He had dropped his eyelids again, and became absorbed in thought. "As for Father What's his name, I think I recognize him. Here, I've burned my coat. They always have too much fire in these cursed stoves." Number 50-52. Former property of Gorbeau. Then he glanced at Marius. "You saw only that bearded and that long-haired man? And Punchard? You didn't see a little imp of a dandy prowling about the premises?" "No." "Nor a big lump of matter, resembling an elephant in the Jardin des Plantes?" "No." Nor a scamp with the air of an old red tail? No. As for the fourth, no one sees him, not even his adjutants, clerks, and employees. It is not surprising that you did not see him. No. Who are all those persons? Asked Marius. The inspector answered. Besides, this is not the time for them. He relapsed into silence, then resumed. 50-52. I know that barrack. Impossible to conceal ourselves inside it without the artists seeing us, and then they will get off simply by countermanding the vaudeville. They are so modest. An audience embarrasses them. None of that, none of that. I want to hear them sing and make them dance. This monologue concluded, he turned to Marius, and demanded, gazing at him intently the while. Are you afraid? Of what? Said Marius. Of these men? No more than yourself. Retorted Marius rudely, who had begun to notice that this police agent had not yet said monsieur to him. The inspector stared still more intently at Marius, and continued with sententious solemnity. There, you speak like a brave man, and like an honest man. Courage does not fear crime, and honesty does not fear authority. Marius interrupted him. That is well, but what do you intend to do? The inspector contented himself with the remark. The lodgers have pass keys with which to get in at night. You must have one. Yes, said Marius. Have you it about you? Yes. Give it to me, said the inspector. Marius took his key from his waistcoat pocket, handed it to the inspector and added. If you will take my advice, you will come in force. The inspector cast on Marius such a glance as Voltaire might have bestowed on a provincial academician who had suggested a rhyme to him. With one movement he plunged his hands, which were enormous, into the two immense pockets of his top coat, and pulled out two small steel pistols, of the sort called knock-me-downs. Then he presented them to Marius, saying rapidly, in a curt tone. Take these. Go home. Hide in your chamber, so that you may be supposed to have gone out. They are loaded. Each one carries 2 balls. You will keep watch. There is a hole in the wall, as you have informed me. These men will come. Leave them to their own devices for a time. When you think matters have reached a crisis, and that it is time to put a stop to them, fire a shot. Not too soon. The rest concerns me. A shot into the ceiling, the air, no matter where. Above all things, not too soon. Wait until they begin to put their project into execution. You are a lawyer. You know the proper point. Marius took the pistols and put them in the side pocket of his coat. That makes a lump that can be seen, said the inspector. Put them in your trousers pocket. Marius hid the pistols in his trousers pockets. Now, pursued the inspector, there is not a minute more to be lost by anyone. What time is it? 2:30. 7 o'clock is the hour? 6 o'clock, answered Marius. I have plenty of time, said the inspector, but no more than enough. Don't forget anything that I have said to you. Bang! A pistol shot. Rest easy, said Marius. And as Marius laid his hand on the handle of the door on his way out, the inspector called to him. By the way, if you have occasion for my services between now and then, come or send here. You will ask for Inspector Javert.